Hello everybody, here Renee from Spain with a new video. And in this video I want to show, like you can see the title already, I want to show bands that everybody thinks they are from the 80s, but they are really not. I don't want to say that these bands are not from the 80s, because these bands did start in the 80s. I mean, their debut albums are not from the 80s. And a lot of you guys maybe think, maybe not you guys, maybe other people around the world, they think, oh, yes, Firehouse, that's the 80s band. No. I mean, they started in the late 80s. Actually, they started under the name of Max Warrior, and they released an album back in the mid 80s, maybe. But Firehouse, the debut album, came out in 1990. And that's what this video is about, Bands that released their debut album during the 90s, not during the 80s. But a lot of people think those bands are 80s bands. It's because a lot of times because the sound. They still sound a lot like the 80s. Because from 89, it went into 90, 91, 92, 93. A lot of these bands, they keep sounding, or they had an 80s sound, Same with the movies. A lot of movies from the early 90s, they look like the 80s, It's like that too. And movies from the early 80s, they still looked very much like the 70s. Okay, there we go. The first band I want to mention, this of course is a band that that released a couple albums in the early 90s, but this one is from 1990, and I'm talking about Tough. And this is a great glam album. I really like this glam album with Stevie Rachel, right? I don't really know how you say his name, on vocals. And this guy also made a website, like years later, of course, during the late 90s, and that was something with I don't know. So like a lot of they got always a lot of dirt out of the bands, the hair bands from the 80s and 90s. They talked about things that were happening in that scene, in the 80s and 90s. Something with Sucks, I think it was. But anyway, I'm not sure the name, but I never really followed that website. But it was more like kind of like roddles. People talked. They talked about, and they made some stories up too sometimes. But this is really a good record. And actually, one song on here, "Wake Me Up," was written by Bret Michaels from Poison. Am I right when I say what, 1990? 1992, wait, let me see. 1991 on Atlantic Records, of course, big record label. Another band people think, okay, they are definitely from the 80s, especially the debut album by Psycho Kick, but this was 1990. And the most famous album by the band was The Lizard. It came out in 1992. And on here we have the great ballad, one of my favorite ballads from the 90s, "Love Is on the Way." That's a great ballad that for sure you guys know. You check it out on YouTube. It was a great song. And they released, I'm just showing some things I have by these bands. Most of them I'm showing the debut albums. Another band that maybe you think, okay, they're from the 80s or late 80s, and they started in the late 80s. And before that, they had a name called Purgatory. And I'm talking about Ice Earth. But this is definitely a 90s band. So many great records they released during the 90s. And this was their debut album. This one is definitely a band that a lot of people get confused with. Slaughter. Of course, Mark Slaughter, we know him from Winnie Vincent, Invasion. And then he formed Slaughter. And then I just want to show the debut album from 1990 and their second album from 92 that I also love. But anything they released was good. I like all the records they made. You know, Fear No Evil is also a great record. Steelheart, another very good example. 1990 again, not released in the 80s. And I just want to show their debut album I just showed, and I want to show their second album from 92. Jackal is another band that people may could confuse with an 80s band, but they released the first album in the early 90s, but this is their second album, and this is the only one I have by them. I never bought the debut album, but I remember them being on MTV quite often. And the band I named before, Firehouse. These are two pure 80s sounding albums. Later on 3, they sounded more acoustic. And they have other records too, released during the 90s. They're not bad at all. But this is the debut album and the second album, 1990 and 1992. And that was it. Yes, that was it. Just I want to show these bands. You know, I thought it was like a different type of video, I thought. Okay, I hope so you like it, guys. And girls, stay metal, everybody.